Here is what we are told. Libraries were built to serve populations. Towns grew, literacy expanded, and as communities developed the means and the need, they constructed spaces to house knowledge. That is the standard explanation. It is clean, logical, and it appears in almost every account of how public infrastructure emerged across the 18th and 19th centuries. The problem is the math. When you begin measuring, not interpreting, just measuring, the relationship between documented population figures and the physical scale of library buildings recorded in that same period, something doesn't balance. And the gap is not small. In several cases across Europe and the United States, library structures were built with a capacity, a physical square footage, and a logistical complexity that exceeded the documented needs of their surrounding towns by a factor of 3, sometimes 5, in a handful of cases more. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions, but the measurements are documented. The population records exist, and the mismatch between them invites a closer look. Let's start with what a 19th century library was supposed to be. By the conventional account, public libraries as civic institutions began to formalize in the mid-1800s. The British Public Libraries Act of 1850 is typically cited as a turning point, the moment when local governments were granted the authority to fund reading rooms using public money. In the United States, the Boston Public Library, opened in 1854, is widely described as the first major publicly funded municipal library. From there, the story moves forward. Carnegie grants, civic investment, expanding literacy, growing collections. The explanation makes sense. As industrialization increased urban populations, the demand for educational resources grew proportionally. Libraries followed people. Except that in a meaningful number of recorded cases, the sequence appears reversed. There are library buildings, documented, surveyed, and in many cases still standing, that predate the populations they were supposedly built to serve. Not by months. In some instances by decades. A town with a recorded population of several hundred residents in the 1840s and 1850s would, by conventional logic, require a modest reading room. A single hall. Shelving for a few hundred volumes, perhaps 1,000. A building with perhaps 1 or 2 designated staff positions. What exists in the physical record is sometimes something else entirely. Reading rooms with ceiling heights of 40, 50, 60 feet. Reading halls that could seat hundreds simultaneously in buildings where the surrounding town could not have produced hundreds of simultaneous readers even at full civic assembly. Catalog systems, where records survive, that suggest the expectation of collections numbering in the tens of thousands of volumes in towns that, at the time of construction, had no documented source for those volumes, no established trade route for book acquisition, and no recorded patron base approaching that scale. This is not a stylistic curiosity. Scale has logistical implications. Building large is not, by itself, unusual. Civic ambition exists. Towns build churches larger than their congregations. Governments construct courthouses for future growth. Overpreparation is a known phenomenon, and historians account for it. What makes the library pattern worth examining more carefully is not that the buildings were large. It's that the largeness appears functional rather than symbolic. There is a difference between a building designed impressively and a building designed operationally. A courthouse built for civic prestige might have a grand facade, tall columns, and imposing entrance, and behind it, a modest working interior scaled to actual need. What appears in several library records of this period is different. The interior systems, the shelving configurations, the catalog alcoves, the reading hall proportions, the administrative spaces, are proportioned to operational volume, not to aesthetic ambition. Someone designed these buildings expecting them to be used at scale. The question the records do not clearly answer is, what scale were they expecting? And where did that expectation come from? The timing adds another layer to the examination. Several of the most architecturally complex public library buildings in the American Midwest were constructed or substantially completed in the period between 1850 and 1880. This was, in many of these towns, a period of early settlement. Communities were still establishing basic municipal infrastructure: roads, water systems, postal routes. The idea that library construction would lead rather than follow basic civic development is, at minimum, an unusual sequence. In some cases, the construction records that survive suggest these were not small undertakings. Materials were sourced from distances that implied significant logistical planning. Skilled craftwork, stone carving, custom ironwork for shelving systems, decorative ceiling treatments, appears in building inventories that suggest either extraordinary local capacity or supply chains reaching far beyond the immediate region. For a frontier or near-frontier settlement of a few hundred people, this level of external sourcing would have represented a substantial economic commitment. Where did the funding originate? The records vary. Some buildings reference private benefactors. Some reference municipal bonds. Some records are incomplete. And in a number of cases, the financial source remains unclear in the surviving documentation. Unclear is not sinister. Records are lost. Institutions were informal. Documentation practices in the 19th century were inconsistent. But unclear does mean unanswered. The scale pressure compounds when you look not at individual buildings but at clusters. When multiple towns across a region, towns with no particular political or economic connection to one another, show similar patterns of overscaled library construction in the same general period, the question shifts. A single anomalous building is an anomaly. A pattern distributed across geography and jurisdiction becomes something the anomaly explanation no longer fully covers. Some researchers have noted the consistency of this pattern across different states, different funding sources, and different documented origins. The consistency itself, the repeatability of the mismatch, is what they point to as significant. Not any single building. The pattern. And patterns, unlike isolated events, require a different kind of explanation. What produces a consistent pattern across disconnected communities in a short time frame? Shared policy? A coordinating institution? A common source? The records available today do not offer a single clean answer. They offer the pattern. And then they stop. Let's move geography. Because if the pattern were limited to one region, one cluster of Midwestern American towns, one specific decade, one set of local conditions, it would be reasonable to contain the examination there. Regional anomalies have regional explanations. Local eccentricities produce local outliers. That is normal. But the pattern does not stay contained. When you examine library construction records from the United Kingdom in roughly the same period, the decades surrounding the 1850 Public Libraries Act and extending through the 1870s and 1880s, a structurally similar picture emerges. Buildings constructed in towns of modest documented size, with interior configurations scaled to operational volumes that the surrounding population could not, at the time of construction, have supported. The same functional largeness. The same early timing. The same gap between what the records say the town was and what the building was built to handle. In parts of northern England, mill towns, manufacturing settlements, communities defined in the historical record primarily by their industrial output rather than by any particular cultural or educational tradition. Library buildings appear that carry the same interior logic seen in their American counterparts. Reading rooms designed for simultaneous use by populations the town would not reach for another generation. Catalog infrastructure implying collections that, in several cases, the acquisition records do not fully account for. This is not a romantic characterization of Victorian ambition. Victorian England did build impressively, that is documented and well understood. The civic pride of industrial Britain expressed itself in public buildings regularly. But again, the distinction being examined here is not between modest and grand. It is between symbolic scale and operational scale. Between a building that looks large and a building that was built to function at a size the surrounding town had not yet become. Several buildings in this category share another feature worth noting: the speed of their construction. Where timelines survive, some of these structures, with their complex interior shelving systems, their reading hall configurations, their administrative infrastructure, were completed in periods that, given the documented labor conditions and material supply chains of the era, suggest either a level of organizational efficiency that is not well explained in local records, or a building process that began from something other than a standing start. In other words, some of these buildings may not have been built entirely from scratch. That is not a claim. It is a question the physical evidence in some cases raises. The United States offers additional examples that push the pattern further. The Carnegie Library Program, beginning formally in the 1880s and accelerating into the early 1900s, is the conventional framework through which American public library expansion is understood. Andrew Carnegie funded the construction of over 2,500 libraries globally, with the majority in the United States. The program is well documented. The philanthropic logic is clear, and it explains a significant portion of the library infrastructure that emerged in this period. But the Carnegie program does not explain everything it is sometimes asked to explain. There are library buildings that predate Carnegie funding, sometimes significantly, in towns that show the same overscaled, operationally configured characteristics as their better documented counterparts. And within the Carnegie program itself, researchers examining the original architectural specifications have noted something worth sitting with. The standardized plans distributed to recipient towns were not modest. They were not calibrated to the size of the receiving community. They were calibrated to a consistent operational template that was applied across communities of vastly different sizes, with relatively limited adjustment. A town of 800 people and a town of 8,000 people might receive buildings that differed in facade treatment and surface detail but shared nearly identical interior functional configurations, reading hall proportions, catalog room placement, shelving load specifications. The template was not scaling down to fit the town. In many cases, the town was being given a building built to a standard that exceeded it. Infrastructure before demand. That phrase appears in the work of researchers examining this period from several different disciplinary directions: urban historians, architectural historians, librarians studying institutional origins. The phenomenon has a conventional explanation: civic optimism. Builders and funders anticipated growth and built ahead of it. That is a documented pattern in public infrastructure generally. But the degree of anticipation, and its remarkable consistency across disconnected communities, disconnected funders, disconnected regions, and disconnected nations, is where the conventional explanation begins to feel incomplete. Optimism varies. Local conditions vary. Political will varies. Economic capacity varies. What does not seem to vary across a surprisingly wide sample of library buildings from this period is the basic functional template, the operational logic, the presumption of scale. If each community were building independently, based on its own civic ambition and local projection, you would expect variation. You would expect some towns to overbuild dramatically, some to underbuild, most to land somewhere in the middle. What the record shows, in aggregate, is something closer to consistency, a consistent overshoot in a consistent direction using consistent interior configurations. Consistent patterns across independent actors usually suggest a shared source, a common instruction, a standard being followed rather than independently derived. What that source was, if such a source existed, is not answered by the records currently available. There is another element the physical buildings carry that resists easy explanation: their condition at the time of the earliest available documentation. Photographs taken of some of these library buildings within years of their supposed completion, in some cases the earliest photographs available, show structures that carry the visual characteristics of significant age. Weathering patterns, stone treatment, certain structural settling behaviors that, in conventional construction, develop over decades. This observation has been made informally by architectural researchers and more formally dismissed, on the grounds that early photographic processes produced visual artifacts that can mimic age effects. That is a valid counter-consideration. Photographic chemistry in the 19th century was imprecise. Exposure times and development processes could produce misleading textural readings. And yet the observation keeps being made, by different people, looking at different buildings, in different regions. Repeated observations that resist clean dismissal tend to accumulate rather than dissolve. Some researchers who have examined these overlapping patterns, the scale mismatches, the pre-demand timing, the cross-regional consistency, the unresolved financial origins, the photographic anomalies, have begun grouping them under a broader interpretive framework. That framework has a name. And the name itself carries significant controversy, which is worth understanding before it is examined. The pattern exists in the records before any label is applied to it. The label came after. The word is Tartaria. If you have encountered it before, you likely encountered it in a specific context. Online forums, alternative history communities, video essays that move quickly between photographs and conclusions. The name carries associations that tend to precede examination. And those associations make it difficult to look at what the label was originally applied to, and why, without the weight of its most extreme versions arriving first. So it is worth being precise about what the term means, where it came from, and what it does and does not claim, because within that precision, there is something worth examining that the more dramatic versions tend to obscure. Tartaria, in its most historically grounded usage, refers to a geographic designation found in European maps and documents from roughly the 13th through the 18th centuries. The term was used inconsistently and with shifting boundaries to describe large portions of Central Asia, extending in some usages as far as Siberia and parts of Eastern Europe. It appears in the work of cartographers, in diplomatic correspondence, and travel accounts. It was not a unified political entity in the conventional sense. It was a European label applied to a vast and imperfectly understood region. That is the documented historical usage. It is not contested. What is contested, significantly and with legitimate disagreement on multiple sides, is a secondary interpretive framework that began circulating more widely in the early 21st century. This framework suggests in its various forms that the term Tartaria points toward something beyond a geographic designation, toward the possibility that a sophisticated civilization or a network of advanced cultural institutions existed prior to or alongside the documented historical record, and that evidence of this civilization persists in architectural and infrastructural anomalies that mainstream historical accounts do not adequately explain. The library buildings examined in this documentary are frequently cited within this framework as examples. It is important to be clear about what citing them within this framework means, and what it does not mean. The pattern of overscaled library construction, the pre-demand timing, the cross-regional consistency. These are observations drawn from documented records. Maps, building surveys, population records, architectural inventories. The observations themselves do not require any particular interpretive framework to be made. Researchers working entirely within conventional historical methodology have noted versions of these anomalies without invoking Tartaria or anything like it. The interpretive framework is what one does with the observations. And here the options diverge considerably. One interpretation, working within conventional historical analysis, suggests that the patterns reflect the operation of coordinating institutions, philanthropic networks, Masonic lodges, government programs, religious organizations, that imposed consistent infrastructure templates across communities in ways that local records alone do not fully capture. Under this interpretation, the consistency is explained by top-down standardization, a small number of centralized decisions that produce distributed results. The records are incomplete not because something was removed, but because institutional decision-making in the 19th century was often undocumented at the local level, with the originating instructions residing in archives that have not been systematically cross-referenced with the physical buildings they produced. This is a reasonable interpretation. It has historical precedent. It does not require anything outside the conventional framework to function. A second interpretation, offered by researchers working at the edge of conventional methodology, suggests that the patterns reflect inherited infrastructure, buildings that were not constructed in the period their official records suggest, but were instead adapted, repurposed, or redocumented from an earlier period of construction. Under this interpretation, the operational scale makes sense because the buildings were built for a different context, a different population, a different civilization's needs, and what the 19th century record reflects is not original construction but a process of institutional absorption. This interpretation is where Tartaria enters the discussion as something more than a geographic label. Some researchers within this framework suggest that what is being absorbed is the physical remnant of a pre-existing infrastructure network, one that was sophisticated, widely distributed, and whose origins are not accounted for in the currently accepted historical timeline. The library buildings, under this reading, are not anomalies within the 19th century. They are inheritances from something that preceded it. The evidence cited for this interpretation includes the photographic aging observations noted earlier, certain structural characteristics visible in building surveys, and the cross-regional consistency itself, which, under this interpretation, is explained not by coordinated 19th century construction but by the fact that the buildings share an actual common origin in an earlier period. It is worth stating clearly, this interpretation is not accepted within mainstream historical scholarship. The mechanisms it requires, a sophisticated pre-existing civilization, a large-scale process of institutional absorption, a timeline that diverges significantly from the documented record, are not supported by the current evidentiary consensus. What mainstream scholarship has not fully provided, and what researchers within this alternative framework point to as significant, is a comprehensive explanation for the specific patterns this documentary has traced. The overscaling, the pre-demand timing, the functional consistency across disconnected communities, the unresolved financial origins, the photographic observations. The conventional response tends to be one of partial explanation. Civic optimism accounts for some of it, Carnegie standardization accounts for some of it, incomplete local records account for some of it. Each individual element receives a partial answer. What does not receive a clear answer is the pattern as a whole, the accumulation of these elements appearing together repeatedly across regions and nations and funding sources and decades, in buildings that share a common interior logic no single coordinating institution has been fully documented to have produced. Some researchers argue that partial explanations, summed, constitute a sufficient total explanation. That the accumulation of individually explicable anomalies does not require a unified alternative account, that complexity, coincidence, and incomplete records are adequate to explain what the physical buildings present. Others argue that a pattern this consistent, across a sample this wide, requires a unified explanation, and that the absence of one within the conventional record is itself something the historical discipline should examine more directly. Both positions are held by people examining the same physical evidence. The disagreement is not about the buildings. It is about what level of explanatory coherence the evidence demands. What remains when the frameworks are set aside, when the Tartaria label and its controversy are placed to one side, and the conventional dismissals are placed to the other, is something simpler and more uncomfortable than either position fully acknowledges. There are buildings that do not fit neatly into the story told about when they were built, for whom they were built, and by what process they came to exist. Those buildings are still standing. Some are still operating. People walk into them and borrow books and do not look up at the ceiling heights and feel that anything is unusual. The records that might answer the remaining questions are incomplete in ways that are, at this point, probably irreversible. And the pattern, documented, measurable, distributed across the historical record, continues to sit without a unified explanation that fully accounts for it. That may mean the explanation is waiting in an archive that has not yet been examined in the right way. It may mean the pattern is less significant than it appears when individual buildings are considered together. It may mean something else. What it does not mean at the point this documentary reaches is resolved. The buildings are there. The measurements are there. The gap between them is there. And no one has yet told the complete story of how they came to be exactly the size they are.